At 7:42 in the morning, Technical Sergeant James McKenna watched a P-38 Lightning disappear into the sky with a secret hidden inside its wing. He had 8 minutes to make a choice. 8 minutes to decide whether he was a mechanic following orders, or a man willing to break every rule he had been taught to save the pilot sitting inside that aircraft. Lieutenant Robert Hayes was flying into a fight he might not survive. 20-3 years old. 6 combat missions. No victories. Ahead of him were Japanese Zero fighters aircraft built to turn tighter, react faster, and exploit every mistake American pilots made. McKenna knew exactly what would happen if Hayes entered the wrong kind of fight. He had watched it happen before. The pilots were told the same thing every day. Do not turn with a zero. Use speed. Use altitude. Attack. Climb. The P-38 was faster, more powerful, more heavily armed. But in a close-turning fight, it was losing. And McKenna had watched too many young men, because of a problem nobody wanted to admit existed. The pilots were blamed. The report said they had made mistakes, but McKenna had worked on their aircraft. He had touched the controls they trusted with their lives, and he knew the problem was not inside the cockpit. It was hidden inside the machine. The P-38 was supposed to respond the instant a pilot moved the control stick, but it didn't. At high speed, the delay meant nothing. In a fight, when a pilot had less than a second to survive, it meant everything. The control cables had just enough slack to create hesitation. A tiny movement the engineers considered acceptable. A tiny movement that places zero behind an American pilot before the aircraft responded. McKenna had reported the problem. The answer was simple. The aircraft was within specifications. The system was working as designed. But McKenna had seen what the specifications did not show. The aircraft was working. The pilots were dying. And now another pilot was preparing to fly. Hayes had followed the rules. That was the problem. He knew the doctrine. He knew what he was supposed to do. But combat was not a training exercise. The enemy did not follow the manual. Every time Hayes needed his aircraft to move faster than the zero, it hesitated. Every time he needed the machine to save him, it reacted too late. McKenna had watched enough, but knowing the problem was different from fixing it, because fixing it meant crossing a line. A maintenance sergeant was not supposed to redesign a fighter aircraft. He was not supposed to change flight controls. He was not supposed to install parts that had never been approved. If something went wrong, the responsibility would belong to him. The system gave him one answer: follow the rules. His conscience gave him another: do something. On the night before Hayes' mission, McKenna walked alone into the maintenance hangar. The aircraft was silent. The lights above him hummed. The P-38 waited in the darkness. He opened the inspection panel. Inside was the problem he had known about for months. The cable moved, then stopped. 3-8ths of an inch. A tiny amount. Almost nothing. But enough. Enough for a zero pilot to pull the trigger. McKenna reached into his tools and pulled out a piece of piano wire from a damaged aircraft. It was not an official part. It was not tested. It was not approved. It was simply something he believed might work. He bent the wire into a small Z shape. His hands shook. Not because he did not know what he was doing, because he knew exactly what he was risking. If the modification failed, Hayes would die, and McKenna would be the reason. He could still stop. He could close the panel. Walk away. Let the engineers handle it someday. But someday would not help the pilot taking off in the morning. So McKenna made the decision. He installed the tensioner. He removed the slack. He changed the aircraft. And then he closed the panel. The moment the decision was made, the choice belonged to the sky. The next morning, McKenna stood on the flight line and watched Hayes climb into the cockpit. There was nothing left to fix. Nothing left to explain. The aircraft either worked, or it did not. At 7:42, Hayes took off. McKenna watched until the P-38 disappeared. Then he waited. When the Japanese fighters appeared, Hayes faced the same problem every P-38 pilot faced. Hayes returning inside him. A moment where the aircraft had to answer faster than human reaction. A moment where the machine usually failed. But this time, something changed. Hayes moved the stick. The aircraft moved immediately. No delay. No hesitation. The P-38 rolled exactly when he commanded it. For the first time, Hayes was not fighting his airplane. He was flying it. The Zero tried to escape. Hayes followed. The aircraft responded. The gap disappeared. The enemy that had always been faster in the turn suddenly found itself vulnerable. Hayes fired. The first zero fell. Then another. Then another. When he returned to base, he walked straight to McKenna. His hands were still shaking. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. He looked at the mechanic who had changed his aircraft and said only, "It worked." But McKenna's decision had created a new problem. Because now other pilots had seen what happened. They had seen a P-38 move differently. They had seen a machine that could finally answer the person flying it. And they wanted the same chance. Captain Frank Mitchell was one of them. He had watched Hayes fight from above. He knew Hayes was skilled. But he also knew Hayes had not suddenly become a different pilot overnight. The aircraft had changed. Mitchell found McKenna after landing. He asked one question. "What did you do?" McKenna had a choice again. He could deny it, protect himself, keep the secret, or admit what he had done and allow others to take the same risk. McKenna told him. The wire. The modification. The violation. Everything. Mitchell understood the danger. He also understood something else. Pilots were dying while everyone waited for permission, so he made his own decision. He asked McKenna to modify his aircraft. The secret spread the same way the problem had spread. Person to person. Pilot to mechanic. Mechanic to mechanic. No announcement. No official order. Just men who had watched friends disappear into the sky deciding they were on accepting the same outcome. Every modification carried the same risk. Every mechanic who installed one was breaking regulations. Every pilot who flew one was trusting a change nobody had approved. But every pilot who survived made the decision harder to ignore. The aircraft looked the same. The engine was the same. The weapons were the same. Only one thing had changed. The machine finally responded when the pilot demanded it. Then the enemy noticed. Japanese pilots had learned the P-38. They knew its strengths. They knew its weaknesses. They knew exactly how long it took to roll, exactly how long it took to reverse direction. They had built their tactics around those fractions of time. But now those fractions were gone. The Zero pilots were fighting an aircraft they thought they understood. They were wrong. A hidden change inside the P-38 had changed the fight before the fight even began. Eventually, the military discovered what the mechanics had done. The question was no longer whether the modification worked. Everyone already knew. The question was what to do with the people who had broken the rules to create it. Punish them, or admit they had solved a problem the system had missed. The answer came slowly. The modification was tested. The results were undeniable. The idea that started with a piece of piano wire became part of the aircraft's future design. The system eventually accepted the solution, but the man who created it remained almost invisible. James McKenna never became famous. He did not become known as a war hero. He returned home and worked on machines again. Cars, anything that needed fixing. When people asked about the war, he rarely talked about the secret modification. To him, it was simple. He saw something wrong. He fixed it. But the decision was never simple. Because the hardest choices are rarely made by the people with the most authority. They are made by the people standing closest to the problem. The pilots who flew the P-38 seconds changed the battles they fought. But before they ever entered the sky, one mechanic changed the machine beneath them. The story was never about the fighter plane. It was never about the weapon. It was never about the battle. It was about the moment one man decided that following the rules was no longer enough. And that single decision changed what happened next.